All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. And we are here to welcome Scott Thornbury as our final keynote speaker for the Okinawa JALT Summer Symposium. And Scott has taught and trained in many countries, including Egypt, UK, Spain, and New Zealand. And until recently, he was teaching on the MA TESOL program for the New School. He's got lots of books to his name, and he also does courses for the International Teacher Development Institute, ITDI, as well as the very, very popular DogMe group that has just kept going and going, and everybody speaks very highly of it. So we're really glad that Scott was able to come and join us today, early in the morning though it is where he is, and I'll just let him take it from here. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me. And welcome everybody. I see there's a great spread of names and geography, so I'm impressed. I've missed the conference, I'm afraid, today because of the time difference, because I'm in Spain. I regret bitterly missing many of the talks, which in a sense connect to the theme that I want to talk to, which is the conference theme, which is the past, present, and future of language education. So forgive me if I retrace some of the ground that's already been covered. And also forgive me if some of this presentation looks familiar to you if you've been to previous talks of mine on the topic of methods. I will be reviewing some of that, what I call the archaeology of methods. But then I take a radical turn about 20 minutes in. So if you can bear with me, those of you who have seen my methods talks before. And then I do hope that we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. So please bung your questions into the chat. I don't guarantee I'll catch them as they fly by, but I will scroll back at the end to see, and then you can always repost them. So, as I said, I'm interested in the archaeology of English language teaching. Many of you know that I have a kind of obsession for collecting old grammars, old textbooks, old dictionaries, etc., which give us, or give me, a kind of insight into where we've been. And I think I would like to say, and I hope it becomes clear today, that also they give an insight into where we're going. This is a few from my library. Great titles, these. Interesting English, one of them's called, like, not awesome English, but just interesting. That'll do. Probably downside more interesting than the course. English in English is another one there, and that's a significant title, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. And then if you see the second from the left, Practical English Lessons, I've got a page of that I'll show you in a second because it's relevant to the Japanese context. But I love these books, apart from anything else, their design, and some of them, of course, are emblematic. They represent the history of English language teaching. The Look and Speak by Michael West, the Berlitz books, of course, which I will come back to and refer to, and the influence of technology as it has evolved over the years, and the classics like Eckersley, etc. None of you will remember because none of you are old enough to remember these books, which were the equivalents to the Headway and English File of their time. The one I want to draw your attention to is this one. What was it called? Practical English Lessons. I found this in Tokyo by a senior called Saito. I don't know his first name. Unfortunately, I can't show you the physical copy because it's locked away in my office. But you get a flavor of what the book and its period was like from the graphics, and also from dialogue number 2. What have you done with your old gun? Really, I think, kind of useful language. I've lent it to a friend. What have you done with your dog? I've lost, it's been stolen or shot, perhaps. But here we have, of course, the classic blend of English and grammatical explanations in the learner's L1. So we have a sort of difficult to know what methodology this particular writer subscribed to, but clearly the use of the old one was tolerated, particularly in the grammar explanations. Methods of English are often associated with course books. In fact, the word método in varieties of Spanish means both method and course book. And so this is a course book from, or textbook found in Barcelona, which has a nice graphic too, which is this one here. Why do you always recommend this method, meaning this course book? Because it's both practical and pleasant. And that, I suppose, is the bottom line in terms of methodology, practicality and pleasantness, or fun, we would call it now. But of course, we've learned to be suspicious of methods, both in their course book manifestation, but also as prescriptions for methodology. But these cautionary notes or caveats about methods have been around for a very long time. This is a book for teachers, a methodology book published in 1913, and he says, do not be too confident with regard to certain new methods, especially do not believe too easily in certain practical ones. So the practicality may, in fact, if it's not based on any sound principles, may in fact be misleading, and particularly if it promises to teach many wonderful things in a very short time. Method itself, even the best method, however important, is not everything. A very great deal of success depends on the natural gifts, the previous training, the energy and the experience of the individual teacher. And I mean, you know, so there's nothing more to be said. We could finish the talk now and say, yeah, it's over to you guys. You're the ones who actually will mediate learning much more than any method or any course book. But we have some time to fill, so I want to hold that point and argue that there is some point in looking at methods, not because they're prescriptions necessarily what you should do, but as a kind of source of well-used practices. Say Richards and Rogers in their standard text on methods and methodology. So they are a source of well-used practices, and they are well-used, a lot of these practices. They've been around for a very, very long time. And so they must have worked for somebody. So I think they're worth digging into, and that's why I collect, one of the reasons I collect the books which enshrine them. And of course, therefore, methodology or the history of methods is often a component in teacher training courses. But it's represented, I think, rather simplistically, as if it were a kind of evolutionary tree. That is to say, we started off in the swamp, if you like, the protozoic swamp of grammar translation, and we've been slowly emerging over the centuries into the light as new methods are based on sounder principles, on research into second language acquisition, etc. And so it's very much on methodology, and I'm guilty of this. I've done this myself, presented the history of methods as a kind of a slow march. And you see it here in this book, which I have no quarrel with, but they've done a chronology of methods suggesting that grammar translation, for example, was around in the 1850s and persisted until 1930 at least, when it kind of faded from sight. Whereas the direct method came in later, lasted slightly longer, and so on. But I think, I mean, we all know that this is a vast simplification of what's going on, that grammar translation, for example, is alive and well, and the direct method in one form or another now facilitated by technology, as in apps, for example, both grammar translation and direct method feature still quite strongly. So it might be, so instead of representing the evolution of methods like this, it may be the case that methods, it's more like the title of this talk, it's kind of swings and roundabouts. So we revisit periodically the same basic principles. They just come in and out of fashion, not in an arbitrary kind of process, but because of various educational beliefs and even ideological beliefs, which underpin the particular time and place where the method has been adopted. And Alistair Pennycook said this a good while ago in a very useful article in TESOL Quarterly. He says these changes in methodology have represented not advances, if you like, not evolution, but different configurations of the same basic options. So I just want to quickly sketch in what those basic options are, and I'm using as my kind of rubric these 6 characteristics of methods as identified by Jack Richards and Dick Schmidt in their Dictionary for Language Teaching and Applied Linguistics, that methods reconfigure different views on these 6 things: the nature of language, the nature of second language learning, the goals and objectives in teaching, the syllabus type, the role of teachers, etc., and the activities and the techniques. In other words, a method is not simply defined by its activities and techniques. It has underlying these a view, a belief, a theory of the nature of language and the nature of second language learning in particular. So what are these, what are the kinds of parameters here that we're talking about? And I'm kind of using the notion of dimensions, which was first outlined by H.H. Stern in this book in 92. But I think he has 3 dimensions. I've added a few more, that one of them being the view of language, whether it's form-based or function-based. And we've seen the kind of pendulum swing over the years, or I have at least, between formal approaches to language description and functional ones. Functional, of course, meaning what does language do? We're using language to tell stories, to apologize, to request, to give commands, etc., as opposed to the form, present simple, present perfect, third conditional, all that kind of thing. This is not to say that a formal approach ignores function or a functional approach ignores form. But the starting point, particularly of syllabus design, is either the forms of the language. Today we're going to do the third conditional, or the functions. Today we're going to do talking about past regrets, for example. And then there's 2 dimensions here, at least, in the nature of learning, how we view learning, whether we see it as a kind of analytic process where you break everything down and kind of build it back up again, or an experiential one, a more deep end approach, whereby you, as we do when we're learning our first language, we experience 24-hour round-the-clock immersion in the language, and through that contact and use, we acquire the language. And of course, there's another dimension is whether language learning is a purely cognitive phenomenon. It happens only in the mind, or whether it's affective. You could add to that affective, embodied as well. Is it a physical thing, and to what extent is it physical or embodied as part not just of the mind but of the whole body and of course the whole person? What are the goals of second language learning? And again, we've seen a fluctuation over the years from a focus on accuracy and a focus on communication and back to accuracy and so on. For communication, of course, you could read fluency too, and all its many definitions. The types of syllabus, whether the syllabus is focuses on the systems of the language, like reading, grammar, pronunciation, etc., vocabulary, or on the skills, or to what extent it focuses primarily on the skills such as reading, writing, speaking, listening, whether the syllabus is segregated, it's separated from the rest of the curriculum. This is the English language class, it's got nothing to do with the rest of the subjects in the school, for example, or whether it's integrated into the curriculum in the manner of, for example, CLIL, content and language integrated learning. And what are the role of the teachers? And again, the traditional role of the teachers being the transmitter of knowledge, pouring knowledge into the empty vessels of the grateful learners. And clearly, I mean, transmissive models of language teaching, or transmissive models of education, are not specific to language teaching. They've existed across all subjects in all cultures, as opposed to a more dialogic approach where there's a greater symmetry, if you like, and reciprocity between the teacher and the learners, and that learning is, in a sense, jointly constructed out of the language that emerges in the room, as it were. That would be an extreme form of a dialogic approach. Interestingly enough, transmissive teaching has had a comeback in the last year and a half as we've all moved online, and a lot of teaching allegedly is much more transmissive than it used to be, because it's very difficult, or it's more challenging to be dialogic in this kind of context that I'm talking to you now and I can't even see you. And finally, the teaching procedures, whether, for example, the teaching of grammar is deductive, that is to say it's rule-driven. This is the rule for the third conditional, or whether it's inductive, whether the learners work out the rules from examples. And finally, whether the teaching procedures are cross-lingual. This is using Stern's term, but by that he means bilingual or multilingual. That is to say that the learner's first language forms part of the learning process, is incorporated and integrated into the learning process of the second language, or whether the learning process is completely intralingual, that is the L2 is the only language in the classroom, in which case it's, you could substitute, I think, monolingual versus multilingual or bilingual. I'm just using Stern's vocabulary here. So what we get then is a kind of, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 different dimensions, I've called them, of methodology, which represent some of the options that Pennycook mentioned in that quote about, it's all about reconfiguring these different options. And if there was a workshop, I'd ask you to kind of position yourself in terms of where you are on these, and to think of these as not polarities necessarily, but dimensions or spectra. And where would you put yourself in terms of your current practice, whether you're kind of more form focused or more function focused, whether you're more accuracy focused or communication focused, etc. And I can guarantee that probably what we'd see if everybody shared their configuration is some kind of wavy line going down the middle, because none of us like to think that we are completely based in one side or the other. And also, of course, you can see that if you scan down the left-hand column, there's a great deal of crossover here, or correlation, let's say. So if you are form focused, you're also more likely to be accuracy focused and to focus on the system of the language, like its grammar, for example, than on the skills. Whereas if you are more functionally inclined, and you'll perhaps being more experiential in your approach, adopting methods which are sort of deep end, if you like, and that you may in fact be a more dialogic teacher because of that, etc. So what we've got here then are, and I'm not saying this is exhaustive, but it's a way of characterizing methods traditionally, but also characterizing teachers' individual methodology or the institution's methodology. We just see that the history of it has been swinging from one end to the other kind of thing. And that's the swings, or if you like, going round and around the roundabouts. And what's very interesting is, in fact, as much as you look at the methods and think these are so radically different from each other, and these different ends of the spectra are so totally opposed, they in fact tend to kind of, there's a lot of wooliness and fusion or merging going on between these different extremes, such that it's often very difficult watching a teacher's lesson to work out what method they actually subscribe to, or even reading a course book. What is the method here? I mean, really, if you unpick it. And in fact, way back in 1987, Tony Howard, who's written extensively about the history of English language teaching, along with Richard Smith, has said that, and he's talking about communicative language teaching, CLT, and this is in 1987, which CLT was a relatively new kid on the block then, it was only 10 years old. He said most of the essential features of direct method and structural language teaching, structural language teaching where we focus on form, pattern practice, audio-lingual methodology, have remained in place in CLT, largely unexamined and undisturbed, just as they have been for a century or more. He goes on to say CLT, this is the communicative language teaching, which is so revolutionary, supposedly in its time, has adopted all the major principles of 19th century reform. The reform movement, countering grammar translation in the late half of the 19th century. So these are some of the principles that have remained intact in CLT. The primacy of the spoken language, speaking first, for instance, the inductive teaching of grammar. You look at any course book now, and every single grammar presentation is through, well, virtually through, now work out the rules, answer true and false. Is it true that you use the third conditional to talk about the future? The belief in connected text, whole text, as opposed to isolated sentences, and most significant of all, the monolingual or direct method principle that the languages should be taught in the target language, not in the pupil's mother tongue. No, all change, but no change. And this principle that I've highlighted here is the one I really want to address, because I can see this as being the one that's most controversial in that list of dimensions that I gave you. That is controversy about accuracy versus fluency. Should we focus on one or the other, etc.? But there's nothing more guaranteed to get teachers in a kind of panic or hot and bothered is the argument about use of L1 in the classroom. And Stern himself said, and I mean, he's the one who, first of all, identified that, what he called the cross-lingual versus intralingual dimension, said, that one, he said, this pair has resulted from one of the most long-standing controversies in the history of language pedagogy, the role of the L1 and L2 teaching. And he says for many teachers, the cross-lingual, that is to say the bilingual strategy, is no longer considered a point of discussion. There's no contest. It's not even worth talking about. In theory, this is not 1992. In theory, language teaching today is entirely intralingual. That is to say, in his terms, monolingual. And then he says, he adds this little caveat. We suggested it may be time to reconsider the issue of a cross-lingual strategy. That was in 1992, 30 years ago. And some people would argue that that reconsideration is long overdue. And let's look at Japan. Now, I'm completely out of my comfort zone here. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is from a relatively recent article by Andy Kirkpatrick and AJ Liddycoat, looking at language teaching in the Asia. And they took a look at the Japanese curriculum, and they call this new curriculum. Now, I don't know how new this new curriculum is. You will know better than I do. But they say, not only specifies the content for Japanese language instruction, so this is the curriculum for national, state school, public education. It also states that in principle, English should be taught through the medium of English. English should be taught through the medium of English. That is to say, Stern's words, the intralingual strategy. And they say this move marks a movement away from older ways of teaching that emphasize the use of Japanese for instruction in foreign language classes in an attempt to increase the proficiency of high school graduates. So the bilingual, or what we think of as the grammar translation approach, or if you like, yakudoko, which is for those not conversant with Japanese education system, is the kind of Japanese equivalent of grammar translation, although arguably it's quite different and a local product. And they go on to say this policy creates a conflict for many English teachers, as the curriculum is predicated on a communicative approach. So here we go, we're trying to move the curriculum down to the right-hand list of factors on the dimensions, because it emphasizes fluency. Meanwhile, and this is always the tail that wags the dog, the testing system, the assessment system privileges declarative knowledge about language, that is knowing the rules and being able to explain them, and privileges accuracy in the application of grammatical rules. So you have a direct tension here between, on the one hand, the goals of the curriculum and the way that it is assessed, but also a tension between the new and the old, if you like, saying what we should, the reform of the curriculum in Japan, and not just in Japan, all across the world. These reform movements have attempted to push national language curriculum in the direction of a communicative approach, dragging many teachers howling and screaming and resisting, or at least feeling guilt at still maintaining some of their old practices. And then we have this other thing that's going on. So there's a tension not just between the monolingual view, but now there's a pendulum has swung all the way back, in Europe at least, towards plurilingual competence. You look at the new companion volumes come out for the Common European Framework of Reference 2 or 3 years ago. And it's all about plurilingual competence, multilingualism, the ability to switch from one language to another, to express yourself in one language and understand a person speaking another. And look at the third point, to call upon the knowledge of a number of languages to make sense of a text. In other words, what it's saying is, it seems to be, or implying at least, that there is a place for many languages in the one classroom, or at least two. So what we've got here is that where are we meant to be on this spectrum? We're getting so many mixed messages. Should we go back to grammar translation, or stay with grammar translation, or should we adopt the English only policy? And what that means is, for many teachers, is that it provokes a sense of guilt that they're not positioned right on that spectrum. So this is from a recent study, came out in the TESOL Quarterly, looking at teachers in Canada and their attitudes to English only. And one teacher who worked in Egypt said, "Hello, Hassan, Egypt, I felt guilty because in Egypt we didn't allow the students to use Arabic at all." Yeah, this is in their English classes. I felt guilty. And that was actually a challenge. I actually caught myself a couple of times telling them, guys, please here at the EAP program, please English only, English only. This is the EAP program in Canada, because the teacher's experience in the past in Egypt was English only, and she was using that same strategy in her EAP, English for academic purposes, and she felt guilty because she was insisting on English only. So this is the kind of tensions that these changes in policy create. And Stern again says too many teachers consider the use of a cross-lingual strategy, that is the bilingual one using the L1 in class, a fall from grace. It's not something you talk about amongst your friends. You don't mention it in the staff room. I do some translation in my class. I do explain things in Arabic or whatever. They see it as a practical compromise and not as a legitimate and theoretically justified procedure. And Stern goes on again. So remember, this is 1992 we're talking about here, and he's advocating for a rethink. He said, we would like to suggest that an intralingual strategy would be more effective if its cross-lingual counterpart, that is using the two languages, were more clearly recognized as a strategy in its own right, complementing, not replacing, but complementing an intralingual strategy. So that's what I want to kind of look at in my kind of future gazing. I want to predict that maybe this development that Stern was suggesting in 1992, we need to pursue it. I'm not the only one, of course, but let's just quickly look at what was wrong with grammar translation that forced people into an intralingual or monolingual strategy. And one of my many books that I've collected, and one I'm most proud of, this one cost me 25 euros in a flea market in Barcelona. Ollendorf's new method was hugely successful in Europe in the 19th century, so successful that it was endlessly plagiarized. So you had to be sure that you were getting the original thing. So he signed and numbered every copy of the book. But of course, we know, we can have a good laugh at the kinds of sentences that students were asked to translate. Which beer has your servant drunk? He has drunk mine. Am I blah, blah, blah. Have you seen my aunts? I like this one. Hassan, for you. Has your father ever seen any Arabs? I have sometimes seen some in my travels, one or two. So this is what really gave grammar translation a bad name. And it was because of that one reason that Berlitz burst upon the scene. And this is a book that, again, I own. This is the edition from 1906, I think. And he took, this is the big swing of the pendulum from grammar translation, of course, to the direct method, or as he labeled it, the Berlitz method. The fundamental principles being direct association, hence it's called the direct method, no translation, no mediating, no cross-lingual strategy whatsoever. And his justification for that was these three arguments that, and this is his own words, time spent on explanation or translation detracts from the time that could be spent using the target language. There's a waste of precious time. Could be using the target language, not talking about it in Japanese or Arabic, Spanish. And very significantly in this one there's very persistent this view that students don't learn to think in the L2 if they are all using both languages in the classroom. And finally, the lack of equivalence, which translation implies there is equivalence. You can translate War and Peace from Russian into English perfectly easy. And other people will say, no, you can't. You lose a lot in the process. Well, that's War and Peace. I'm not sure if a sense like the pen of my aunt is on the table loses a lot when it's or have you seen any Arabs, loses a lot when it's translated back and forth. Come to that point when we look at online translation tools, if we have time. Let's go back to this one, the first one, time spent on explanation, to track some time that was spent using the target language. There was a study done in Britain in the 1960s, I think, or 70s, a big study teaching French in primary school in Britain, in England, using the direct method. And a big study was done of the effect of the results in terms of the learners learning. And also they interviewed these kids and asked them what they thought about the process of learning French through the direct method. And I love these quotes. This is out of the mouths of babes. Our teacher explains in French, and when he has finished, I still don't understand a word. Now, how is that economical use of time? The teacher blurts out a lot of French words I haven't heard before and expects me to understand them. And then another one, slightly more constructive, said, well, I would like after the teacher said something that she repeats it in English. We will be able to understand better, I'm sure. And the other one said, I'm sorry, I can't understand the teacher. She never tells us what she's on about. That happens with teachers, whether or not they're using the direct method, of course. And I love that because, I mean, this seems to contradict the view that direct method is economical in terms of time if it's creating all this. Now, the other argument, do we learn to think in a language, is a vexed one. And most psycholinguists now would say that very rarely do people transition to the point, especially adults, that they're actually thinking in the second language. And it's usually when they do that, it's in situations where they have total immersion and they've been immersed for some considerable time. You certainly don't start thinking in the language from day one. Oh, incidentally, on the subject of confusion, Roger Brown wrote this lovely piece when he was learning Japanese, actually, through the Berlitz method. And he stuck, this is in the 1970s, he stuck at it. He said the immersion experience, yeah, it is a bit like being immersed, like children in their first language, but the insistence on avoiding the first language sometimes seems to lead to a great waste of time. So again, the time factor and to problems children for some reason seem not to have in their first language. He goes on to say, let me read, he's describing his lesson, his Japanese lesson. One long morning, my teacher tried to put across 3 verbs, kimasu, yukimasu, and karimasu, forgive the pronunciation, with the aid of paper and pencil drawings of pathways and persons and Loki, and by much moving of herself and of me, uncomprehendingly passive, as a patient in a hospital. But I could not grasp the concepts. I feel Mr. Berlitz would have suffered no great dishonor if the teacher had said to me that the concepts in question sometimes go by the names come, go, and return. And I think that catches again very well. Just going back to the question of thinking in a second language. Well, no, sorry. I keep changing this. There's more Japanese content. This is an interesting article. Well, a vigorous defense of Japanese use of grammar translation, or what as core grammar translation, again, and used here as a way of kind of resolving problems, troubleshooting. Translation is just a way of making sure that students have rightly understood the target text or discourse. I've come to subscribe to the opinion that what deserves special mention about translation is its troubleshooting function in the classroom. Do we think in the second language if we've been immersed in it from day one? And Henry Sweet, like, how long ago was this? 1899. Henry Sweet, incidentally, was the prototype of Henry Higgins in the Bernard Shaw's play, Pygmalion, now turned into, once turned into a musical called My Fair Lady. The remedy usually prescribed is to learn to think in the foreign language. But Sweet said, we cannot think in a foreign language till we have a thorough and ready knowledge of it. So that this advice, sound as it is in itself, does not alter the fact that when we begin to learn a new language, we cannot help thinking in our own language. We cannot help thinking. You cannot say to students, don't think in Japanese. It's like saying, don't think of little green monkeys. You do. Or, I love this, much more simply put, second language is looking into the windows cut out by the first language. So where are we all with all this endless backwards and forwards? Harold Palmer, again, somebody you should be familiar with, who did most of his formative work in Japan, said, this is 100 years ago to the day, how prescient these old blokes were. They're all blokes. It is time to rehabilitate in some measure the character of the comparatively innocent process of translation. Comparatively innocent. It's not going to kill you. And to remove the stigma attached to those who still use the mother tongue as a vehicular language. The stigma, this was, teachers felt stigmatized when they confessed to using the L1 in the classroom. He says, maybe it's time to rehabilitate that. Now, Stern said the same thing in 1992. Guy Cook, as we'll see, said it more recently. By so doing, by using the learner's first language, we proceed naturally enough from the known, the L1, to the unknown, which is how we learn anything. We start with what we know, and we build on that. And Guy Cook, of course, wrote this book, now nearly a dozen years old, but still well worth visiting. The problem has been that monolingual approaches, his argument is that the monolingual approach assumes that the student's primary goal is the need to operate in the new language monolingually. Yeah, and that the measure of success, therefore, is how well they adopt and melt into the norms of monolingual speakers. And we know that very few of our students are going to become native-like to the extent that they cannot be distinguished from a native speaker, nor do they necessarily need to or want to. And of course, even since 2010, the notion of translanguaging has become more and more prominent, and we see it in the rhetoric of the Common European Framework, for example, a lot of stuff coming out of mainstream studies of bilingualism, translanguaging, which is an approach to the use of language, bilingualism, and the education of bilinguals that considers the language practices of bilinguals not as two autonomous language systems completely separated, but as one linguistic repertoire. And to be communicative linguistically, you draw on your repertoires. That's the argument. So this is my crystal ball gazing. And when we make predictions about the future, we do it at great peril. Who would have predicted 2 years ago that we'll all be teaching online now? Nevertheless, and yeah, when we make predictions, they are kind of often tinged with a little bit of both hope and apprehension. So this is my way forward. That I'm seeing this process that people like Harold Palmer were talking about 100 years ago. We need to rethink the separation of languages that H.H. Stern was querying in 1992. That Guy Cook was querying more recently. We need to carry on questioning that, and I'm arguing that it's well past time that we dusted off grammar translation and rehabilitated it, given now what we know about how languages are learned. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but we've seen how old style grammar translation is risible, yeah? It's ludicrous because of its examples, etc. But is it, if you change the examples, can you reform grammar translation? And I believe that you can, and that a reformed grammar translation would look like this on the right. So instead of the grammatical syllabus, today we're going to do the present simple. We have a task-based syllabus. This is a nod to Jeffrey Jordan, I think, is in the audience. It's not incompatible with using translation at some stage in the task process. Sentence level examples can be replaced by text level examples. So prop discourse and invented texts. Have you seen any Arabs with authentic texts? Whereas the old style grammar translation focuses purely on literacy. raw form GT, that's grammar translation, not gin and tonic. I know where you're at now. I know it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. A focus on oracy, yeah, on spoken and written. Sorry, that should be spoken and, both spoken and written language, yeah, not just written language. You can perfectly, and I'll show you in a second, have an inductive approach to grammar translation. The focus need not be only on accuracy, but could be on intelligibility, fluency, communicative effectiveness, etc. The lessons can be conducted mainly in the L2, so there's no reason why this target language should be banished. And so some writers now saying that a good balance might be something like 10% L1, 90% L2. But it depends so much on context factors and level and all sorts of other things. And of course, mediation now is the buzzword in the Common European Framework, the new syllabus or supplement that you think of using translanguaging, not as translation, word for word translation, but a way of mediating between speakers of different languages. And we need to teach those skills. And soon there'll be those skills will be examined, because once they get into the Common European Framework, they become testable, they're validated. So here's an example, for example, the language that some of you may well know. I think there's some Kiwis in the audience. Te Reo Maori. Now, assuming you don't know it, and we're not going to do this, we don't have time, but here are some words, some sentences in Maori, and there are the translations. So look at the sentences, look at the translations, and then see if you can induce, that is to say, infer some of the grammatical rules of at least sentence structure or word order in Maori. And then, having done that, translate the 3 sentences at the bottom into Maori. So, I mean, that's, easily designed. It can be designed for any language. There's the sentences L1, this sentence L2, L2, this sentence L1. Look at them, work it out, groups, pairs, etc., and off you go. And activities which switch backwards and forwards between texts. This is a book that I have a vested interest in because I edited it, the Cambridge Handbook series, Philip Kerr's excellent book on packed with practical activities. This idea of reverse translation is a great one. We're assuming, of course, that your students all share the same first language, and the teacher does. But even if the teacher doesn't, in this case, it doesn't matter, as long as the students share the same first language. So you get a text, which is in English, which in our case is the target language. You have it translated into the student's own language, which in your case may be Japanese, Arabic, or whatever. Yeah. You give them the text in English to look at, you discuss it, you do whatever you do about it with the text, check comprehension and so on. Then you take that away and give them the translation, and they have to translate it back into English so that it's unseen, yeah? Another way of doing this, of course, is have them translate the text, the English text into their first language, or have them doing it in groups. This is a lovely activity that Julian Edge wrote about years ago, English Language Teaching Journal. So you have 2 groups, let's say. The students are given a text. One group is given the text in English, another group is given a similar text in English, about the same length, probably about the same topic. Might be a joke, it might be a little news item, whatever. And they translate it into their first language, which is Japanese or Arabic or Spanish or whatever. And then they swap the texts around across the groups, and they see this text in Spanish, let's say, and they translate it back into English, having not seen the original text. And then they can have a good look at how these texts compare with their originals by moving the group members around or moving the texts around. Yeah, students translate back to L1, they compare their text with the original. And Julian Edge goes on to say that in 1986, the procedure creates a communicative context for more formal follow-up work. Yeah, it's a great way of focusing students' attention on features of the language that may be different or similar, to the L1. The bilingual teacher can carry out contrastive work on problem areas that arise. And formal L2 work can be done by having students look up in their grammar reference books those sections that deal with the problems that have been met. So again, it could be totally student-centered. You found some differences here. You translated that as that, but it's not in the original. So deal with it. Yeah, here's the grammar book. Find out what the problem is. And similarly with Lexis, etc. So you see you've got a kind of task-based cycle here, but it integrates translation into the cycle. And of course, we know of methods in the past, or some of these so-called fringe or niche methods, which relied very much on translation and worked very well because of it. I'm thinking of counseling learning or community language learning. You remember this one from the 60s, like based on group therapy kind of counseling sessions where you have a student, each student, well, in this case, has a private teacher standing behind them who speaks their language. And then when they want to say something, they ask the teacher, how do you say that? They whisper it in their ear. They commit it to the group. When they feel it's right, it's recorded, and you build up a conversation of recorded snippets, which are directly translated, particularly at the beginner's level, from the students at L1. Now, because it only works with very small groups and where there is a bilingual teacher. There's certainly not any situation I know, but there's 6 teachers in the classroom. But the principle, of working from the known to the unknown and building up text, which can then, subject to scrutiny, that transcribed goes onto the board and then teacher chooses things that he or she thinks are in there. Suggestipedia is another one, of course, from the same era, the so-called humanistic teaching approaches, which filled the vacuum that was created by the demise of audiolingualism. Incidentally, I tried to unobtrusively show the cover of this book, but I'm now going to show it obtrusively. In case you don't notice why I'm so obsessed with methods, I just wrote a book about it. So there we are, the students are listening to a text in whatever the target language is. Let's say it's English, but they're hearing the translation into their first language. Let's say it's French at the same time, or line by line. So that complete and utter security as they're lulled into a state of hypnotic suggestion. But I would like to suggest to you, hypnotically or not, that there's so much could be gained from using the tools that are available now for getting students to translate text. I'm thinking of Google Translate. I don't know why do people knock Google Translate? I have zero problems with it. And if you do, take a text, I've done this and I'd show it to you now, but I don't have time. Take a text on any language, a real authentic text, run it and have it translated into, let's say, a language which is very dissimilar. Let's say English into Urdu. Then take the text in Urdu and have it translated back and compared to the English, and to be amazed how similar it is. Or I've done this too. Go 2 languages down the line. English to Urdu, Urdu to Swahili, Swahili back to English, and then compare to the original. It's going to be different, but not substantially. Amazing tool. Now, if I was a learner of Catalan, let's say, which I have been, this is what I would have done if I had Google Translate 30 years ago, is say, okay, I need some expressions to get me going in Catalan conversations with my neighbors here. Bang those into Google Translate, hit Catalan, and there you get it. And you can't hear this, but I can. They're also you've got a voice transcription, audio version of the text. Now, there may be mistakes in there, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is pretty damn good. And that gives me my phrase book to get me going. And I can write those phrases onto my word cards, which I carry around with me on the bus. So these are word cards, homemade word cards for a French learner. But amazingly, this is all credit to the Japanese. You can go to the local Muji shop here in Barcelona and buy word cards which you can attach to your keychain. Isn't that brilliant? Did you know about these? And they're on recycled paper to boot. Or, of course, digitally, you can queue in all these phrases into an online onto an app, a flashcard kind of app like Anki, or so that's the interface with Anki. I put all the expressions in, I create my own word lists, which I can consult. Quizlet, of course, does the same thing. Those things have been around for quite some time, and they are, if your students are not using them, I think they ought to be. They are a great way of improving their vocabulary and formulaic language knowledge, apart from anything else. And of course, we've also got Duolingo, which works on a similar kind of basis, although it plans the teaching for you. And it gives you sentences which are not that far removed from "have you seen any Arabs?" This is the learning of some Scandinavian language, I think. I do not hear you, since I have cinnamon rolls in my ears. Now, that's not a sentence the student created. That's a sentence that's been thrown up by some algorithm, presumably. But I mean, so we're going back to square one. Talk about swings and roundabouts. So here's another one. I think this is Finnish, maybe. The bride is a woman and the groom is a hedgehog. So we haven't, moved on a lot from the mid-19th century in terms of authenticity, you would like to say. But we have all these things now at our fingertips. And not only that, and of course, they've got gamification software built in, which makes the whole thing fun. But, and this is the elefante in dem Zimmer, do we really need any of this at all, given the way that technology is moving? Look at these headlines. Simultaneous translation software. I'm not talking about Google Translate now. I'm talking about something you have on your phone. You walk around, you say into English, what do you want to say? And your interlocutor immediately gets the translation, hears it on their headphones in the language that they understand. Yeah? So there's a lot of hype in the last few years about advances in this technology. And you probably know more about it than I do, being in Japan, a lot of you, where this technology is probably making great strides because it is there already. And if we're looking into the future, we don't have to look very far to see its possible applications and implications on language teaching. So why go to school for 8 years to study English if you can download the whole thing onto an app and have conversations in English, even if you don't know a word of it? If you're a Japanese speaker, for example, why bother? Yeah, it's all there. Well, I used to think 5 years ago that this was the biggest threat since global warming. And Scott Crossley, in a very interesting article I totally recommend, was also making similar predictions in 2018 when he looked at these advances. And he said, so technological advances in simultaneous machine translation may have profound effects on the motivation that drives people to learn a foreign language. He said it is likely that in the near future, many potential language learners will decide not to learn a foreign language, and instead rely on simultaneous machine translation applications to communicate with people in that language. Well, that was 2018. Watch this space. Are we any further down that line in that direction? And arguably, you could say that the move to online learning may have accelerated these advances in technological simultaneous translation, or they may not have. They may have given people a nostalgia for real language classrooms, whether or not the methodology embraces allows the first language or not. So I just want to finish now, because I'm kind of out of time practically, with a warning and some advice. And the warning is this, that, it's all about context. And I'm not telling you, and don't ever let me read anywhere that Scott Thornbury says we should be using L1 in the classroom. No, but I think we should be reconsidering the prohibitions against it. But it's all about context. And this article by a Canadian who reflected on her own use of L1 in the classroom said decisions about appropriate L1 use are in large part inextricably tied to classroom circumstances and cannot be predetermined nor easily generalized from one context to another. I would actually go further and say decisions about anything are in large part inextricably tied to classroom circumstances. You know, the accuracy, fluency, the experiential versus the cognitive, etc. It's all about the context. You are the ones who have to judge. But here are my takeaways, the suggestions for if we're going to rethink, if you haven't already, the role of L1 in the classroom, then maybe you need to negotiate a language policy for your class. So what do you want, guys? Do you want to speak Japanese in the class? How much? What percentage? For what purposes, etc.? Do if you can do this, and you're teaching a group that's all share the same L1, do comparative analysis between L2 and L1. So you'll find lots of things are similar and lots of things are different. And it's worth knowing, and it's worth the learners knowing from the get-go, you know, what are the challenges in terms of the differences, and what are the challenges in terms of some similarities. You know, the similarities are kind of similar, but not similar enough. Build L2 knowledge from L1 knowledge. Be a bit more tolerant about translanguaging and code switching. Teach mediation skills since it's the flavor of the month. Yeah, so you can have a discussion. We're going to talk about, I don't know, the Olympic Games, the rights or wrongs of it. Have it in Japanese, by all means, and then report it to the rest of the class what you talked about in English. Yeah, so they can get it off their chest, their ideas, but then they know that the outcome of the task is reporting in the target language. Teach the constructive use of translation tools. You know, students are going to use translation tools. We know that to do their homework. We can tell when they've done. I mean, they're not so perfect, translation tools. They're not. We can't tell when they're using them. Or so sometimes it's difficult. But teach students. I had a friend who's teaching a private one-to-one woman who was doing secretarial studies here in Barcelona, and her level was something like A2. But she was having to deal with texts which were way beyond that level immediately. So he said, well, I'm not going to teach you the language. I'm going to teach you how to use translation tools constructively. I'm going to shortcut the language. And you'll pick that up as you go along. But you need to get going with translation tools. Because we're teaching communication skills, not not monolingualism, not trying to create English speakers walking around in Japanese bodies. So that is that. And we don't have a lot of time, and I completely ignored the questions, but I don't know. Anne, did you catch any?
Yeah, there have been a couple. Just a second. Let me come back here. You have a question from Jeffrey Jordan back here somewhere.
Name rings a bell.
Might be somebody you know.
What's Jeff got to say for himself?
He wanted to know if you agree. He says, in Long's 2015 task-based syllabus, predominant use of L1 is recommended, partly because of negotiation of meaning. To implement Deller's lexical syllabus, teachers are told to use the L1 whenever possible to save time and get on with teaching as many chunks as possible. In your set of 2 dimensions, it seems that using L1 translation will be more favored by synthetic syllabus form, deductive transmission, etc. approach. Do you agree?
No, I don't actually, but I can see the point. And I would argue that in my rehabilitated GT, that would be, can be completely task-driven. The syllabus could be a task-based syllabus, but you use mediation skills. You recognize the value of cutting corners, of cross-lingual comparison, etc. I ought to add, though, that there are sound arguments from within the task-based literature against overuse of the L1, just as any, I think, methodology, regardless of the syllabus. And I recommend, you must know this, but Rod Ellis and Natsuko Shintani's book on pedagogy, SLA Pedagogy 2014, they have a whole chapter using the L1 and the L2 classroom. This chapter should be essential reading. and particularly they do focus, because Rod Ellis's commitment to a form of task-based language teaching, they do focus very much on how compatible a task-based approach is with an analytic syllabus, if you like, rather than a synthetic syllabus. But it's a very good question, Jeff. Thank you for raising it.
And if there's one
can
more.
I say something?
Yes, Jeff, pipe up.
Yeah, I quite agree. It's not a black and white, you know, it's down the middle, a zigzag, of course. Just that some people like Bella, for example, encourage the use of L1 to kind of save time so that they can get on with teaching the bits that they think need to be taught. Whereas those who take an analytic view, like Dogme and a strong view of TBLT, unlike Rod Ellis's view, which isn't at all compatible with Long. But in any case, I think it's a lovely book. I agree with you. I think it's very excellent reading, but I don't agree with their view of TBLT. Anyway, the point is that obviously, if you're going to use a TBLT, a strong thing, like a strong version, then you really do need to be predominantly in the L2 in order to negotiate for meaning for one reason.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jeff. And I think negotiation for meaning, or of meaning, what you want to call it, it implies that you don't take the easy route. You say, oh, I don't understand what you're saying. Just tell me what you're saying in Japanese. I mean, that's not going to get you very far down the line. You're going to become, we all know that. So I think it's all about the level, and it's about expediency to a certain extent. But I think, yeah, I mean, I know my own experience. I mean, some of you know I went back to the classroom 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm for Spanish, an intensive Spanish. I'm a B2 C1 Spanish speaker, and I should be better. And I was irritated by the fact that the teachers used English to kind of cut corners. I thought, no, don't treat me like a baby. I'm B2. I would like to think of myself as C1. So like, treat me like one, and let's just use Spanish in the classroom because time is short, kind of thing. So I think, you know, this is where we need to consult our learners, and we need to educate our learners. There's no single answer, and every context is different. Every learner is different, but it's something that can be negotiated. Thank you, Jeff. Anything else there, Anne, that's fled by?
I think that's all we have time for. But if you don't mind staying around for the social event a little bit while afterwards, then maybe we can.
I should pour myself a G&T. I mean, a grammar
the grammar translation with lime.
You appreciate it's only 11 in the morning here, so I'll join you for coffee. I'm sure Jeff has got some hard stuff under the desk. Anyway, listen, Anne, thank you so much again. Thanks, everybody. Sorry, there was a bit of a race. I put more in than I knew I had time for, but I just thought that there were things that needed to be said. But anyway, I'll hang around for a bit. If anybody wants to engage with me, then I would be very happy to talk to you. So Anne, what do we do now? So
there are a few closing matters before we move on over to our social event. And I would like to hand this over to Grant, who might talk about membership for a moment.
Thank you, Scott, for that wonderful presentation. Let's give Scott a great round of applause. Wonderful. You know, it's after all these presentations, I feel like I need about 2